Okay, great. So welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today's webinar is presented by Dr. Paul Rozier, who is a professor in the history department. And Paul, are you still the chair? I'm sorry, I should have looked that up beforehand.
Mark Alicki's chair.
Yeah, okay. No, so former chair of the history department, and I've been an advocate of sustainability at Villanova for many years, and has great history on our the progress that we've made, the struggles that we continue to face, and the opportunities that lay before us. So thank you, Paul, for sharing what you teach in your classrooms for the rest of us to learn from. Thank you.
Thank you, Liesl, for coordinating this series. And I just want to say that I have a lot of slides that I want to go through, partly because I'm summarizing a lot of different classes and using a lot of different material and touching on a lot of different themes. So bear with me. And then the idea is to have a conversation about some of those sources and how we can integrate them into various classrooms, but also raise some questions about how do we reach students and how do we get them to address some really difficult questions of sustainability and climate change, because it is a daunting set of circumstances, complicated by COVID, which we can tie to environmental conditions. So these are some of the themes that I explore in a variety of courses, including one with Frank Galgano, the Sustainability Studies Seminar, which I've taught several times with him. I usually teach an introductory class for core history students, as well as a master's class that I'm currently teaching. So I use a variety of materials, some of which I'm going to reference specifically along the way, and I'm happy to send any of these documents, any of these readings, or any of these images, and I'll share the PowerPoint for anyone who wants it, including those who end up watching it as a recording. I would mention first that I have been using for several years the device of starting a class with a song, because there are so many great environmental songs out there that deal with the environment. The more I look, the more I find, including some recent ones. Neil Young's A Rock Star Bucks a Coffee Shop, talking about Monsanto. And I include some down below. The French have a number of songs, and that comes from this book that I mentioned, The Light Green Society, Ecology and Technological Modernity in France, 1960 to 2000, a terrific book that has implications for other countries. So I start a class with a song, we talk about the lyrics, it helps students adjust from physics to history and so forth. So I would recommend that, partly because there are a lot of great songs out there. So I start with conceptions of nature, starting with Genesis. The first part with the fill the earth and subdue, which people see as a license for taking advantage of the earth, but then we revisit another part of it to look at the idea of cultivating and caring for the environment, which is certainly a core principle of Catholic social teaching. Then I shift to a couple of alternative views, including Native American views, which revolves around a kind of equality between man and nature. The idea of calling the beaver nation, or the deer nation, to suggest that there are some rules of engagement with the natural world. And that's really where I start the course, taking a look at early modern European ideas about nature, thinking about the earth, the world as a feminine living being. And you can see it represented in some of these images. So that's the starting point, and the idea is that there are a lot of rules about what you can do with the earth because it has implications for global health. It's both a local view, but it also takes a global view, thinking about the earth as a living thing. And then we look at the rise of science, the scientific revolution, Baconian ideas, which are very much gendered. The idea of taking nature by the forelock and controlling nature and digging into the earth to discover her secrets. And the discourse becomes one of the earth as a wicked stepmother that's hiding her treasures, and it's up to us to penetrate the earth. There's a lot of very gendered language in the scientific revolution. So we start with that. I did that key transition to the Industrial Revolution. We look at the effects of early industrialization on British society. some images of early pollution that triggers both state intervention in the form of laws dealing with smoke pollution, but also the rise of the Romantic movement, some of which will be familiar to you. Jerusalem by William Blake is perhaps the most famous example of Romantic poetry, but Wordsworth has some really interesting poems that are very nostalgic for British, a green British, and that speak to a relationship to nature that is really critical to British identity. So British Romanticism forms really the foundation of the first challenge to industrialization. So I explore that a little bit and then take it to the United States, where I look at how nature becomes the source for a lot of original genres, thinking about transcendentalism as an American philosophical contribution that's based on a relationship to nature. New kinds of fiction that situates the environment as a character in the drama of settlement. Certainly America the Beautiful expresses the idea of America as a place of incredible natural resources and natural treasures, America the Beautiful. And I also talk about the originator, the creator of the poem America the Beautiful, which becomes a song, Catherine Lee Bates, because she was one of a new generation of women who begins to explore nature. She climbs, I think, Pikes Peak in Colorado, and that inspires her to write the poem. But it's about how women are asserting themselves as being capable of hiking and backpacking, that kind of thing. And then we get to the Hudson River School, which again is another original form that America is deriving from its environment. So the idea with British Romanticism and American forms is that nature helps to create national identity. And I use a couple of sources. One is an article on the Lowell Mills, the British version of industrialization, to think about how people are adapting to new artificial spaces, new buildings, new cities, and so forth. And then through this article about the mill girls, looks at how these women who are stuck in these mill factories for 364 days a year, how they escape into nature and they rediscover what nature is to them. And so there are all these different poems and all these different writings from these young women who start to articulate these romantic and transcendentalist ideas that are coming out from Thoreau and Emerson and the Hudson River School. These are two of the most famous images from the Hudson River School. And this one in particular, the oxbow, is really useful for sharing with students because you get so many different responses. And the question is, where is the good and where is the bad? And most times students say, this is the good, this is the civilized part, and this is the wild and crazy and unpredictable part. But I pair that with a really underappreciated essay by Thoreau called Walking, where he explores the implications for turning this into this, and how, if we are not careful, the rest of the country, the world, is going to become like this. It's going to become denuded, deforested, and it's going to become artificial. So, of course, Thoreau and others celebrate the wildness in this scene. And so it's a way to think about how we approach these binaries of good and evil, wilderness and civilization. And one of the things that I think is useful is kind of eroding this binary between nature and culture and trying to find the in-between space, the hybrid spaces. So these are really helpful images that I use to explore these themes. And then this is another image that I find really triggers a lot of responses. How do we place value on these different sides? And this, of course, the railroad is the literal and figurative engine of progress, and it heads off into the distant future. This is the trajectory. It's eventually in 1869 going to link the country from east to west. And here again is this notion of progress, transforming this wilderness, savage space where two native people live. They're choking on progress in a sense because they haven't adapted. And so we look at what are the implications for taking this point of view, turning this into this, what happens to society. And one of the arguments that Thoreau made is that by doing that, we turn ourselves into beasts of burden. We've lost our connection to nature, which is what is necessary for us to be human. So that's what I do in a big part, in the middle part of the class, is to look at how notions of progress are represented. And then we, for the American West, I ask, what are the implications? What are the consequences of these kind of attitudes? So I turn it to, what are the consequences for the flora and fauna of the American West in transforming this space? And one of them, of course, is the near eradication of certain species, the buffalo being one, part of a military policy to subordinate native people. And we can see both that as a policy, but also as a new resource, as a commodification of nature in the West. This is the most startling image, I think, that shows you the human scale of the destruction of species. These are buffalo skulls that will be used for fertilizer in the East Coast. And you can see the level of destruction. And of course, it applies to other species, including, why is this happening? Hold on a second. Including prairie dogs. And if we take it even further, we apply it to Native Americans who themselves were seen as in need of replacement. And some of the discourse of the American West is Indians are wolves, they're predators, they're savages, they're just prey that needs to be eradicated. So we think about the implications for ideas of progress, who gets to share in that progress. Going back to that image of two Indians on the right side, they're on the wrong side of the tracks, they're not going to survive. That's just the way progress is, social Darwinism in practice. So the American West it plays a big part in my examination of the United States. After that disturbing section, we transition to really the first environmental movement, the first organized environmental movement. Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir, pictured on the right, are helping to lead the conservation movement and the preservation movement, respectively. Teddy Roosevelt is the first environmental president who uses the power of the presidency to protect a lot of lands. And one of the documents that I use, I think to really good effect, two documents, an excerpt from George Perkins Marsh, Man and Nature, where he starts to talk about man as a disturbing agent, not as an agent of progress. And he has this idea of a footprint. And what makes his work so interesting and important is that he talks about it on a global scale, that when we do something in the environment, we really don't know what the implications are, the effects are in a broader ecosystem. So he starts to introduce ideas of ecological devastation on a large scale. And he's important also because he has a big impact on Teddy Roosevelt and his ideas and his actions. One of the most important actions is to hold a National Conservation Conference in 1908 featuring 44 state governors. And he and Gifford Pinchot, who becomes a governor of Pennsylvania, are helping to make the country more sustainable using this idea of wise use, the wise use of all of our natural resources, which today is a controversial term. But one of the things that makes this document interesting is he identifies renewable resources, non-renewable resources, and he said, we're going to exhaust those resources. The US is not a limitless country anymore. Let's stop thinking about it as being sustainable. So time comes for a change. He embeds it in the idea of both moral duty and patriotic duty to conserve those resources, because if you do that, then you conserve the nation. Therefore, environmentalism is about national security, which is an argument I think we can make today. He also references the idea of a future generation, so that we have to start thinking about things in the long term. So this is a really good document to situate the origins of a sustainability discourse, even though they don't use that word. That's not really used until the 1970s. Another thing that I connected to is the idea of farming because both Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot are talking about the erosion of soils, the erosion of farming capabilities, this idea of being able to feed the nation. So I link some of those statements coming out of the Conservation Conference with the Dust Bowl. So we jump to one of the first environmental crises in the country. And after going through some of the stories of the Dust Bowl, I asked the question: was it man-made or natural, or a natural disaster? And the answer is somewhere in between, as a lot of answers are. So we get students to interrogate this question of natural disaster, which I think is really important, because we tend to blame nature when it's really our inability to understand our limitations in nature. So we look at a couple of things to answer that question. One, to see the extraordinary expanse of farming in the United States. And then we look at the rise of technology in the 1910s, mostly connected to the demand for wheat from European countries during World War I. But what it does is it increases farmers' reliance on technology. The weight of these threshers and tractors and combines and so forth creates soil compaction and soil erosion. And then we marry that with the social impact. And I have a great excerpt from The Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck that looks at how people are wrestling with this idea of the tractor as this transformative agent in their lives, partly because it is changing their relationship to the land. It's alienating them from the actual land. So then the third part of that answer is technological and intellectual developments, one of which is that people start to think of the farm as a factory. They apply principles of industrialization to the farm. You have 24/7 farming. You have night farming before you have night baseball. And so you have a whole infrastructure growing up around the idea of power farming, tractor farming, bigger and better. And then by the 1930s, you see the origins and the foundation of agribusiness, the way that these farms become managed on an industrial scale and invested with money from coming out of the 1920s insurance companies. It becomes an investment. It doesn't become a craft. It's not culture anymore, it's economic. So I think that's important, just to situate the origins of agribusiness in this time period with a linkage to the Dust Bowl, because the Dust Bowl is something that is revisited today. I just show students some of these articles that look at drought and so forth in our contemporary time, to just make people aware that this is an ongoing issue that we have to be careful about. So Dust Bowlification enters our vocabulary. The other thing that becomes common is the expanse of pesticides, a new technology that I talk about in the context of Silent Spring. So the next stage is to think about the rise of the second wave of environmentalism in the 1960s and 1970s. We tend to think of it as starting in the late 1960s, early 1970s, culminating and starting with Earth Day in 1970, which we just explored the 50th anniversary of. There are a number of other influences, including the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was managing a lot of the Dust Bowl areas. And what that did was created millions of young men and women who became more attuned to nature, so that by the time they grew up and became part of the middle class, they were really sensitive to environmental change. I look at a variety of books and articles that come out of the 1960s that speaks to the idea of an environmental crisis that we have today. We could look at a similar group of books about sustainability, but some of them are really dire. Can man survive? Mankind may never make it. So there's really a crisis mentality in the late 1960s. This includes books coming out of France, including Destruction and Protection of Nature and Before Nature Dies. So this idea of nature dying and dragging man down with it becomes common in various countries. Of course, Silent Spring is one of the triggers for the movement, and Rachel Carson gets a lot of credit for inspiring people. So I do spend a fair amount of time talking about Rachel Carson and what she's concerned about. First, I'll mention that Paul Shepard's article, The Place of Nature in Man's World, is really worth reading because he prefigures Rachel Carson's critiques by talking about the dangers of pesticides on the human body. So that is worth visiting. Rachel Carson and Shepard are talking about the proliferation of chemicals in everyday life. And here's some examples of how DDT becomes embedded in children's nurseries, on wallpaper. Housewives, men, women, and children are becoming exposed to this stuff on a daily basis. And the chemical industry is very good at plugging it. They come up with a little jingle, DDT is good for me. And the idea is that more is better. More DDT is going to be better for society. And so we see this represented in, and there's this great YouTube clip that I can send anyone. It becomes represented in these scenes from suburbia, which is expanding in the 1950s and 1960s. People want a clean environment. They don't want mosquitoes, so they accept DDT willingly, thinking that it's creating a safe environment, when in fact, it's doing the opposite. And so here's another one. So it's beaches, it's pools, it's picnic, it's city streets, it's suburban streets. And the chemical industry is getting the United States government to buy their product and proliferate. So this is the context in which Rachel Carson is making her arguments, which are both pretty simple and very complicated. One is that these toxic substances are everywhere, including in the human body, which means that the environment and environmental problems start with birth, in a sense, because these are getting into women's bodies. They are also causing cancers and other medical problems. And one of the arguments she makes is that we don't have time to adjust because these chemicals are coming out so quickly, and we're not studying their impact. We're just accepting the fact that they are necessary. And so she challenges the whole concept of the chemical revolution. She challenges progress. She takes on one of the most powerful industries in the country, which is the chemical industry, at a time when she's dying of breast cancer. So it's, I think, an extraordinary act of public service. And she creates this term, the right to know. She says, people have a right to know whether a product is causing harm to their bodies. And this leads eventually to right to know legislation that the chemical industry is very eager to oppose, because it basically says our products may cause cancer. They don't want people to know that. And in fact, this causes an international sensation. Other countries both translate the book and publish their own version of Silent Spring. And the chemical industry fights back. Here in this image, you can see these three executives pounding on the table, telling Uncle Sam to shut her up, because she is, in this image, a witch. And this is how they treat her, as a woman who doesn't know anything about science. So we can think about the gender implications of this story in the early 1960s, of a woman standing up to capitalism, to the chemical industry. The other thing that I get students to understand is that this controversy has not gone away. The chemical industry, in the form of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a right-wing organization, created a website called Rachel Was Wrong, blaming her for millions of people dying of malaria in Africa and elsewhere. They include this list of children who died of malaria, blaming her for their deaths because she sounded the alarm about DDT. It's a false argument, of course, because she didn't say you shouldn't use DDT. She said you need to explore the medical implications. You need to be careful. You need to insulate people from it. And so it becomes a way for the chemical industry and other corporate interests to challenge environmentalism as illegitimate and as unscientific. So if you go to the website, safechemistry.org, you'll see this whole set of arguments against Rachel Carson. The Hudson Institute, another right-wing group, makes the same argument, and it generates a lot of vitriol against Rachel Carson. What a stupid whore, we're living in the aftermath of her destruction. So what this does is it creates a discourse challenging Rachel Carson's ideas, challenging environmental regulations, challenging the right of the government to intervene in these kind of matters. So this continues today in 2020, this challenging of the prerogatives of human health. So what I do is I look at this issue of environmental health in a lot of different contexts. Love Canal, I focus on environmental justice movements to think about how people of color experience environmental issues differently than the mainstream movement. You know, saving the whales or saving the owls isn't a concern for people who are trying to save their children's lives or their own lives, as Dolly Burwell mentioned. She was a key figure in the Warren County Citizens Concerned About PCBs movement in 1982, which leads to the growth of the environmental justice movement, largely because it links environmental issues with civil rights. And so in 1982, you see the American South again with arrests, with civil rights protests, hundreds of people going to the jail. You have interfaith coalitions supporting people of color communities. And what it does is it leads to a new discourse about environmental justice. So you have new words and phrases. You have environmental racism, you have environmental justice, and people have to start paying attention to this intersection of environment, health, and racism. And a lot of the studies that came out in the 1980s argued that most toxic waste dumps affect people of color communities. So I spent a lot of time exploring this. And then another document that's really useful is the 1991 First People of Color Leadership Summit, which brings together Latino Americans, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, and African Americans to think about the common experiences that people have dealing with environmental problems. Finally, I bring it back to the local, which is really important with our students, to think about Chester as a really important example of environmental injustice, so that when our students leave a classroom and put something in a trash can, you can bet it's going to go to Chester where it's burned in one of the incinerators. A really useful documentary is called Laid to Waste, about the Chester story that Villanova students this was done by Drexel students, but Villanova students actually helped this group in Chester back in the 1990s to combat environmental racism. So we always want to think about local and global connections. We don't want to situate environmental problems out there. We want to remember that we are connected to these problems through production and consumption. So that's one major theme, environmental justice. I explore it in India to think about the Chipko movement in the 1970s, the original tree hugging movement where Indian women protected trees because it prevented soil erosion. They needed trees to survive in their villages. We look at the Green Belt movement in Kenya, a similar movement of Native women who are trying to preserve trees as a way to preserve their environments. Wangari Maathai is the leader of that movement, an amazing figure. And then Latin American resistance movements, we look at Amazonian resistance movements, and indigenous peoples who are fighting to preserve their livelihoods against notions of progress in the Amazon. So that's a lot to contend with over the semester. I also close with China because China has the fastest growing environmental movement in the world. It has a middle class that is demanding change. Another good documentary is called Under the Dome, which triggered a lot of backlash from the Chinese government. So we want to think about China as an important factor in global environmental problems, but also global environmental progress. So just to close with what can we do to get students to think about how they can engage some of these problems, both how understand them and engage them. And I really try very hard to end on a positive note, which sometimes isn't very easy. So what I do is I look at various areas of progress. One is in the intersection of faith and environment. There are all of these different books that talk about Christians becoming active in environmentalism, which I think is really important. Certainly we have Laudato Si as an important blueprint for how we should act at Villanova. Another really good document is called Climate, Faith, and Hope, Faith Traditions Together for a Common Future, which emerged out of this Interfaith Summit on Climate Change in 2014. I can send you that document. But that becomes a way to think about the intersections of all these different faiths fighting for the same common goal. Another thing that I talk about is business sustainability movements to legitimize working in business and working for sustainable goals. There are all these different conferences and awards and top 10 lists and all these different phrases. Corporate social responsibility is very important at Villanova and other places. So I look at a couple of examples, including Walmart, which was the Darth Vader of the environmental movement until it had an epiphany maybe 15 years ago. It has enormous impact on the global environment and economy. So we look at some of the factors, first looking at the way that Walmart can practice greenwashing, polishing its image, but also the very significant and concrete ways that Walmart has made important changes that then filter down into the rest of the industry because everybody has to compete with Walmart. And so it becomes a really useful way to think about systemic change. I also take a little bit of time talking about green science and the way that science itself is trying to become more sustainable. Preventing waste rather than dealing with it later becomes an important precept. Looking at various examples, including the zero waste vision. So I want students to tune into some really important changes going on in business. Some of our students will certainly engage the business world, and I want them to take some of these ideas with them. There are a number of different conferences that speak to this intersection of capitalism and environment. So sustainable business, I think, is, as Teddy Roosevelt said, it's about national security. It's about moral duty. And the other thing I do, so this is another example of how capitalism has changed to become more sustainable, giving people an option to invest in green funds and social choice funds. Those are proliferating, and according to recent studies, are doing much better than normal funds. So I think we're in a really good phase for how we invest money away from fossil fuels and into sustainable businesses. The other thing, you want to talk about hope and action. There are all these different books that are speaking to an atmosphere of hope. Hope isn't enough. You want to have action, but you do want to have that as a starting point. A lot of different books that speak to community collaboration, starting on the local level, going to the national level. So I try to catalog all of these different movements that are going on. There's a really great documentary called Tomorrow. It's a French documentary that goes around the world and looks at how different societies and different individuals are making positive change and embracing sustainable goals. So again, to this idea of hope in the face of some really significant problems. And then I close with activism, that it's important for us to put these words into action. Coming up, I could show thousands of different photos of these different movements. I love this one, Don't Mess With Our Mama, coming back to that notion of Earth as a living being. Climate March, and another thing to politicize it a little bit is to think about divestment from fossil fuels. Yale, Cornell, Harvard, a number of other schools are beginning to divest, and I know there's been some movement here at Villanova, so something for students to think about if they want to get involved. And then I invite them to subscribe to the Climate Optimist newsletter that comes out of Harvard. And one of the messages that comes out of this is that everybody matters, especially in an election year. So the last thing I talk about is the need to embrace, if this is what you believe in, and I don't tell people what to believe in, but if you believe in sustainability and these goals, then make sure that you put your action in the voting booth. And I close with this idea that, if you're voting for someone, know where they stand on questions of climate change, environment, and sustainability, because it's your future. So that's it in a nutshell. A rush through 500 years of history and environmentalism.
I feel like I learned so much. Oh my God, that was great. I definitely would like a copy of this presentation, because I think people who watch it, or even those who just are reading the email, will want all those references of documents and papers that you put in there. Thank you for including all of those.
Yeah,
it's a wealth of
library. I can just send you all the documents I did reference.
Great, awesome, that'd be great. Does anyone have any questions for Paul? His presentation? I personally found it, you know, I know this, again, I've heard it before, but it's always great to see, you know, in history, you know, how our politicians didn't always feel like this was a political issue and that it was something to be proud of and, you know, associate with patriotism. I feel like now it's sometimes thought as like the opposite of being patriotic to defend your environment. So it was nice to see at one point Americans did believe that.
And there's a new idea of green patriotism, and it's green in the sense it's good for capitalism. It creates green jobs. It lowers. This is what businesses in France and Germany and the United States and elsewhere, at least some businesses, including Walmart, they understand that they save money. It's more efficient to care about. So that's a revolution in itself that I think is really important.
Yes.
This idea of the light green society speaks to the middle ground, the hybrid. You know, we can't have all, and part of it is wrestling with what nature is. You know, if you go to a national park, is that undisturbed nature, wilderness? Not really, because it's been protected by humans, it's been managed by humans, and I think that's okay. I think we have to come to terms with the idea of a kind of managed nature, managed wilderness, while preserving what wilderness can do for us. Like Thoreau was arguing that it helps us be human by maintaining a sense of mystery and a quiet space and those kind of things. Questions about any of the particular documents or different contexts? I think, Dan, you've heard some of this before in the fourth hour, right?
Yeah, I had you come for our fourth hour too, and I, you know, the comment you made at the beginning about starting the lecture with music about the environment, and like I did feel like it changed the feeling and the mood in the classroom before you even started talking. I thought that was really a brilliant way to kind of set up these conversations.
Well, I'm always mindful that students come from biology, physics, geography in the environment, whatever the case may be, and they have to transition. It's hard to do in 10 minutes. So I'll be happy to send you all the documents I referenced, documentary links, and
Yeah.
PowerPoint itself.
Yeah, I've seen some of those videos of DDT application in communities, and it's really it's really crazy to see. You don't believe that anyone would let their child be sprayed with a chemical while swimming in a pool or eating at a park bench. Like literally putting food in their mouth and being sprayed with chemicals. I mean, it's not funny, but it's almost dystopian because you can't believe that it's possible that anyone allowed that to happen.
Grew up with trucks coming down my street.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And maybe you did as well.
And we see that happening now. At least I think I've seen some videos in China of them driving around spraying, you know, disinfectants. I understand why, you know, that we're trying to do that right now, but like, have we done the science to make sure that it's okay? I'm sure, I'm hoping they do, but I don't know. It brings back bad memories. Anyways, I'm a junkie for history. This was great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Paul. I think everyone who watches this recording will get a wealth of information as well. I'm gonna stop the recording now, but we can always ask questions afterwards.